Hello everyone, welcome back to another edition of Read With Me. Today I'm going to be reading a new book called Stone Blind, written by Natalie Haynes. I haven't read much of this book, I just started it, so we're going to be taking the journey together. Metis changed. If you had been able to see her in the moments before she realized the threat, you would have seen a woman. Tall, long-limbed, with thick dark hair plaited at the back. Her large eyes were ringed with kohl. There was a quickness in the way her gaze seemed to fall on everything at once. Even when she was still, she was alert. And she had her defenses, what goddess did not. But Metis was better prepared than most. Even though she was not armed with arrows like Artemis, or with thinly contained rage like Hera. And so when she sensed, rather than saw, that she was in danger, she changed into an eagle and flew high, the gentle south wind ruffling the feathers of her golden wings. But even with these sharp eyes, she could not see what it was that had made the short hairs pulling at the edge of her plait prickle when she was in human form. She circled in the air a few times, but nothing revealed itself to her, and eventually she flew down and settled on the top of a cypress tree, curving her muscular neck in every direction just in case. She perched there, thinking. She dropped down from the high branches onto the sandy ground, her talons scratching small furrows in the dust. And then she was not an eagle anymore. Her hooked beak retracted and her feathered legs disappeared beneath her. As one muscled body became another, only the intelligence in the slit of her eyes remained constant. Now she slithered over the stones, a brown zigzag stripe along her dorsal scales, her belly the color of pale sand. She flickered across the ground as quickly as she had flown through the sky, and as she paused beneath a large prickly pear, she pressed her body into the earth, trying to feel the source of unease that she had not been able to spot as an eagle. But even as the rats that lived on scraps from the nearby temple raced away from her, she could not feel the footsteps of the creature she should be fleeing. She wondered what to do next. She stayed under the cactus for a long time, enjoying the heat of the ground, allowing her hooded eyes to move, but nothing else. She was almost invisible. She knew. She was faster than most other creatures, and her bite was venomous, devastating. She had nothing to fear. But still, she did not feel safe, and she could not stay here, a snake, forever. She uncurled herself from the base of the cactus and moved into the shade of the cypresses. Suddenly, she reared up and transformed again. The zigzag on her scales fractured and became spots, the scales themselves softening to a coarse fur. Ears sprouted, clawed feet appeared at the end of muscular legs. The panther was beautiful, swishing her tail to send the flies spinning. She moved slowly at first, sensing each individual stone beneath the pads of her paws. Again, she felt the ripple of alarm she produced in the animals nearby, but once more she could not shake her own fear. She ran through the trees, weeds snagging on her fur as her speed increased. They did not slow her at all. She could catch anything, and what could catch her? Nothing. She reveled in her power. She felt almost weightless, pure muscle in pursuit of prey, and then she was caught. Zeus was everywhere and nowhere at once. She could not outrun this bright cloud enveloping her. She flinched as her cat's eyes could not tolerate the glare, changed back to a snake as the cloud seemed to thicken and close in. She tried to slither away beneath it, but there was no beneath. The cloud emanated from everywhere, from the ground as much as from the air. She tried to speed away from it, but whichever direction she turned, it became more impenetrable. The brightness was intolerable. Even through the brill that covered them, her eyes ached. She made one last attempt to free herself, changing forms again in rapid succession. Eagle, but she couldn't fly above it. Boar, but she couldn't gore her way through it. Locust, but she couldn't consume it. Panther again, but she couldn't outrun it. The cloud began to solidify, and she felt herself squeezed. Her muscles began to throb from the pressure, and she had no choice but to make herself smaller and smaller still. Weasel, mouse, cicada. But still the pressure increased. She tried one last time. Ant. And then she heard his hated voice telling her she could not escape him. She already knew what she had to do to make the pain stop. Submit to another pain. Beaten at last, she gave in and reverted to her original form. As Zeus raped her, she thought of being an eagle. The only good thing about Zeus's sexual incontinence his wife Hera had often thought was its extreme brevity. His desire, pursuit, and satiation were so short-lived that she could almost convince herself of their irrelevance. If only it didn't invariably result in offspring. More and more gods and demigods, each one appearing for no reason other than to confirm to her that he was virtually indiscriminate in his infidelity. Even she, a goddess with an almost limitless supply of spite, could barely keep up with the number of women, goddesses, nymphs, and mewling infants she needed to persecute. She did not usually have to turn her attention to his previous wife. Metis was someone she preferred not to think about at all, but if she did, it was with a mild irritation. No one likes to come second or third, and Hera was no exception. Metis had been wife to Zeus long before Hera had been interested in the idea. They had parted so long ago that people had forgotten they were ever married. On good days, Hera didn't think about it. On bad days, she saw it as cheating. It seemed particularly unreasonable that any goddess could claim priority over her, Hera, consort of Zeus, merely by having been there first. And since Hera had many more bad days than good days, she disliked Metis. But because she had so many other provocations to cope with, she usually ignored this. It had been Metis, of course, who had advised Zeus in his war against the Titans. Metis who aided Zeus in his battle with Kronos, his father. Metis who was so wily and clever, always hatching a plan. Hera was just as clever as her predecessor, she had no doubt. But circumstances forced her to use her plots against Zeus, whereas Metis had offered him her wisdom as a gift. Hera snorted. Much good that had done her, Hera had replaced her. Who now thought of Metis in conjunction with Zeus? Who doubted the superiority of his sister and wife, Hera, queen of Mount Olympus? No mortal or god would dare. Which made it all the more infuriating that Zeus had betrayed her with his former wife. The rumor had flown between the gods and goddesses like a swirling breeze. No one dared to be the one who told Hera, but she knew about it just the same. She despised her husband more with each fresh revelation, and she determined to take her revenge. Zeus had been very quiet for the past day or so, no doubt hoping that if he avoided his wife, she might somehow forget her rage. When she heard him returning, Hera sat herself on a large, comfortable chair in her chamber, deep within the echoing halls of Olympus, and looked idly at her fingernails. She draped her dress to reveal more than her ankles, and tugged it down a little at the front. "Husband," she said, as Zeus entered the room, a slightly shifty expression on his otherwise majestic brow. "Yes," he replied. "I've been so worried about you." "Well, Zeus had learned over time that it was better to stop a sentence partway through than lie to his wife. Her capacity to unravel his deceits was one of her least appealing characteristics. "I know where you were," she said. "Everyone's talking about it." Zeus nodded. Of course they were. No one gossiped like Olympian gods. He wished he had had the sense to render them all mute, at least the ones he had created. He wondered if it might be possible to do so retrospectively. Hera sensed she did not have his undivided attention. "And I was worried," she repeated. Worried? He knew there must be a trap, but sometimes it was just easier to jump right into it. "Worried about your future, my love," she murmured and shifted artlessly so her dress fell open a little further. Zeus tried to assess his situation. His wife was often furious and sometimes seductive, but he couldn't remember an occasion when she had been both at once. He moved a little closer in case this was the right thing to do. My future? He asked, as he reached out and pulled teasingly at one of her curls. She turned her head up to face him. Yes, she said. I have heard such terrible things about the offspring of Metis. She felt him stiffen before his fingers went back to caressing her hair. He was trying very hard. It was Metis, wasn't it? This time? She could not keep the edge from her voice, and Zeus quickly wrapped his hand in her curls. She knew he would wrench her hair from her scalp if she wasn't careful. I was just wondering if you can really have forgotten what she once told you about her children, Hera sighed. That she would give birth to one who would overthrow you. Zeus said nothing, but she knew her barb had found its mark. How could he have been so foolish? When he had overthrown his father, with Metis' help no less, and his father had done the same before him. How could he have forgotten what Metis herself had once told him when they were still married? How? You need to act quickly, Hera added. She told you she would have a daughter who would exceed all but her father in wisdom, and after her, a son who would be king over gods and mortals. You cannot take that risk. But she was speaking to the ether, because her husband had already disappeared. The second time Zeus came for her, Metis did not try to hide. She knew what was coming, and she knew she could not evade him. The only thing left to her was to hope that her daughter, she would have known it was a daughter even without her prophetic gifts, she could feel it, would survive. Had she known this was how it would happen, when she told her husband long ago that she could bear him a daughter and then a son who could overpower his father? She knew Zeus's fears better than anyone. He would do anything to ensure that their son was never born. Again, she found herself surrounded by the brightest light, the inside of a thunderbolt. Again, she felt the pressure to become smaller and smaller, panther, snake, grasshopper. But this time, there was no pain, only a sudden, enveloping darkness as Zeus grabbed her in his huge hand, and then a strange sensation of being inside the black cloud that follows the thunderbolt. It was a darkness that would never end. Zeus had, she realized, consumed her, swallowed her whole. Now she and her daughter were inside the king of the gods with no means of escape. And even as Metis understood this and accepted it, she felt something within her, within Zeus, resist it. Stethno was not the older sister because they didn't think of time in that way. But she was the one who had been less horrified when the baby was left on the shore, outside their cave. Uriel had been equal parts baffled and appalled. Where had the child come from? What mortal would ever dare to approach the Gorgon's lair to abandon it there? Stethno had no answers to her questions, and for a while, they both stared at the creature and wondered what to do. Could we eat it? Asked Uriel. Stethno thought for a moment. Yes, she said, I suppose we could. It is quite small, though. Her sister nodded glumly. You can have it, Stethno said. She didn't need to finish. Her sister could see the pile of cattle bones lying beside her. The sisters did not eat from hunger. Gorgons were immortal. They had no need for food. But their sharp tusks, their powerful wings, their strong legs, all were designed for the hunt. And if you were going to hunt, you might as well eat your kill. They looked at the baby again. It lay on its back in the sand, its head propped up on a tuft of grass. Stethno did not need her sister to say the words out loud. It looked like a deeply unsatisfying kill. It wasn't running away. It hadn't even tried to hide in the longer grass. Where could it have come from? Uriel asked again. She raised her huge head, her bulbous eyes searching the rocks above them. There was no sign of anyone. It must have come from the water, Stethno replied. Mortals can't find their way without divine assistance, and even if they could, they wouldn't dare to come here. The baby was brought to us from the sea. Uriel nodded, beating her wings. She scanned the ocean in every direction. No vessel could have sailed out of sight in the time it had taken the two of them to find the baby. They had heard a sound, and it had roused them, and they had left the cave together. No ship, no swimmer could be invisible to them so quickly. I don't know, Stethano said, hearing her sister's thoughts. But look. She pointed at the baby, and now Uriel noticed the circle of damp sand beneath the child and the seaweed-strewn trail leading back to the water's edge. They sat in silence, thinking. It couldn't have been left there by. Uriel glanced at her sister, not wanting to feel stupid. Stethano stroked her broad shoulders, her wings catching the edge of the breeze. I don't know who else could have done it, she replied. It had to have been Forsyth. Uriel's bulging eyes widened. Why would he do that? She asked. Where would he have got a mortal child from? A shipwreck? The Gorgons knew very little about their father. An old god, he lived in the depths of the ocean with their mother, Ceto. They had many offspring besides Uriel and Stethano. Scylla, a nymph with 6 dog heads, and their 6 vicious mouths, who lived in a high cave over the sea from which she could appear to eat passing sailors. Proud Echidna, half nymph, half snake. The Graiai, 3 sisters who shared a single eye and a single tooth, who dwelt in a cave somewhere even the Gorgons would hesitate to go. Stethano and her sister were gradually closing in on the child. The sea whispered behind them. The baby had been left far above the tide's reach. Stethano pointed to the wet trail that led to it. There were paired indentations on either side. Uriel nodded. It was father, she said. Those are the marks of his claws, surely. As they drew nearer, Stethano noticed that the child was sleeping on a messy pile of dead seaweed. Had her father scooped it up to form a sort of bed? Everything she could see and everything she thought she knew were battling with one another in her mind. The thought of Forsyth doing anything as Stethano hunted for the word mortal as laying a baby in a handmade crib was impossible, and yet here were the marks of his claws, each side of the wide path made by his fishtail, and there was the baby lying safely beyond the water, sleeping on a thick pile of translucent dead weeds, like empty skin snakes left behind in the sand, she thought. It was only when they were right on top of the child, and Uriel was eyeing it as an unwanted visitor and an undersized meal, that the 2 sisters understood that Forsyth had delivered it to them for a reason. She has. Uriel dropped into a low crouch, tilting her head for a better view of the child's shoulders. They could see only a little of her back through the seaweed, but her sister was right. The baby had wings. It took the Gorgons a whole day to accept that they had acquired another sister, a mortal one. It took them several more days to learn not to kill her by accident. Why is it crying? Uriel asked her sister, prodding the baby with her hand, talon curled carefully into her palm so she wouldn't injure her. Stethano looked at her sister in alarm. I don't know, she said. Who knows why mortals do anything? Both tried to think of mortals they might have seen behaving similarly, but neither could bring one to mind. In fact, they couldn't remember seeing any human children. But Uriel suddenly thought of a cormorant's nest in the rocks nearby. The cormorant had chicks, she told Stethano, who nodded as though she remembered. The chicks made a terrible noise, Uriel said, and the mother fed them. Her wide mouth split into a grin. She flew a little way inland until she came to the nearest settlements. She flew back with a stolen sheep under each arm. Milk, she said. They give babies milk. And so, even though they were goddesses, they learned to feed their sister. After a while, Stethano found she couldn't remember what their home had looked like without a small flock of curved, horned sheep scrambling over the rocky ground with ease. Even Uriel, who had once combed the sky searching for prey, seizing it in her mighty jaws and crunching its bones for the sheer pleasure of the sound, seemed to enjoy looking after them. One day, an eagle tried to pick off one of their lambs, and Uriel rose in the air to defend it. The eagle was too fast for her, and she returned empty-handed, a few of the bird's feathers falling to the sand behind her. But still, it did not dare to try again. In the early days, Stethano wondered if Forsyth might return to explain his behavior or to bring a message from their mother Ceto. but he never came. The two Gorgons felt differently about this. Uriel was proud that their parents had entrusted the strange mortal child to them to look after. Stethano wondered if her father had left the child with them, hoping they would fail. It was impossible for gods to look at mortals and not feel some revulsion. Stethano loved her new sister as much as she loved Uriel, but she still had to repress a shudder when she caught sight of her sister's horrifyingly small hands and feet, her revolting little fingernails. And yet, even if something had gone wrong with her birth, Medusa was a Gorgon too, and perhaps she would improve with time. Because this was the next upsetting development, the baby kept changing, growing, shifting as they watched, like Proteus. No sooner had they adapted to some inexplicable feature of her than she developed a new one. They carried her everywhere because she couldn't move on her own, and then without warning she could crawl. They grew accustomed to that, and then she stopped crawling and started to walk. Her wings grew along with the rest of her, and it was a relief to them both to discover that even if she couldn't fly very well, she was not completely earthbound. Uriel confessed that the wings reminded her that they were sisters in spite of everything. They felt a brief surge of hope when her teeth appeared, but they were small and stayed firmly inside her mouth, not like proper tusks. She could use them to chew, but what use was that to anyone? As Medusa would not stop changing, her sisters had to change too. Stethano learned to make bread because milk no longer satisfied her. The three of them stared at the dough as it blistered and rose on the wide flat rock they had balanced over their fire. Uriel had been watching women perform the same chore and had brought back instructions and advice. The more time went on, the more they found themselves copying the humans who lived nearby. Mortals have always feared the Gorgons, but the feeling was not reciprocated. Although their sisters, the Graii, lived in a cave as far from humankind as they could, the Gorgons simply lived where they chose, and people avoided them. Neither sister could remember why they had decided on this particular spot on the shores of Libya, but they had made it their home. They had a wide, sandy shore, bordered on both sides by large, sun-bleached rocks, marked here and there by tufts of sturdy grass. The rocks formed great outposts, a hard climb but an easy flight for a Gorgon to reach the highest points and gaze out over the sea, with its sharp-beaked birds diving for fish, or to turn to face inland across the vivid red earth and the dark green scrub. And cutting across the furthest edge of the shore was a jagged scar in the rock, left by one of Poseidon's earthquakes, which had almost torn the land in two. The ground was higher on the Gorgon side of the breach, but not by much. Nonetheless, it gave the two of them an unspoken sense that they had picked the right part, the higher part of the coast, for themselves. Libya was home to many creatures. Cattle and horses were their closest neighbors, brought by the people who had settled nearby. Uriel remembered a time when there were no humans within a day's flying of their home. They used to be further away, but something had changed. She asked Stethano if she could recall what had happened, but there was never any point asking Stethano about these things. She always thought the world was as unchanging as they were, but even the Gorgons had changed, Uriel said. They had been two, and now they were three. Stethano shrugged and said perhaps it was the weather. Humans worried about the weather, didn't they? Because they had animals to feed and crops to grow, and perhaps that was the difference. The land was drier, hotter than before. Uriel reminded her sister of a time when they had flown across great swaths of green bursting with noise, the conversation of swallows, the call of bee-eaters, and the song of crested larks. When they had landed beside a huge lake and watched the storks bathing in the still water. Stethano nodded uncertainly. She never disputed her sister's memory, but she didn't always share its clarity. Gradually, Stethano agreed. Their neighbors had moved closer to the coast, closer to the sea, but their secluded shore remained private because it was too inaccessible, and anyway, men told each other stories about the creatures they believed they had glimpsed there. Monsters from the deep with huge mouths, vicious tusks, leathery wings, so fast and strong and always to be feared. They had manes like lions, or hair made from snakes, or bristles like wild boar. The Gorgons were everything and nothing to most mortals, Stefano said. She might remember less than Uriel, but she understood more. And so men avoided their home, the beach and the sea, the rocks and the cave. The cave which Stefano thought they must have chosen because of Medusa. Uriel knew they had lived beside it before Medusa was their sister, but she never mentioned it. The cave was Medusa's home, as soon as she was big enough to explore it. Gorgons loved the heat. Stefano and Uriel could lie for hours in the scorching sun, unfurling their wings and allowing the warmth to seep through them, but Medusa would squint in the brightest part of the day, and her skin would become too hot. When she was still small, she found shade beneath her sister's outstretched wings, but as she grew bigger, she spent long days learning the recesses of their cave, its many hidden tunnels and paths, and the way the jagged scar visible on the sands could somehow also be found underfoot in the blackness inside the cave, so intimately that when the sun grew too hot, she would kiss her sisters on their bearded cheeks and withdraw to the cooler air to sleep. Stefano had no daughter, but she felt like the mother of Medusa, and she knew Uriel felt the same. And although she hadn't chosen the emotions she now experienced, she tried not to be appalled by them. The confusion and revulsion that Medusa had first provoked in both sisters had ebbed away. The anxiety, however, had not. Stefano had never felt a moment of fear in her life before she was responsible for a child. What should she be afraid of, a Gorgon like her? Of men? Of beasts? The idea was absurd, and she had never experienced fear for another creature until Medusa. She had never felt the slightest worry when Uriel was away hunting or exploring. Her sister could defend herself against any attack, just as she could. And then there was Medusa, who could be hurt by anything, even a stone. Did all children have such unsteady limbs when they were small? Did they all collapse with no warning? Did they all spout blood when they came into contact with anything hard? Forgetful as she was, Stefano remembered one thing, and that was the cold dread which shuddered through her when Medusa tripped over the grasses that their flock negotiated without hesitation. She had been playing up on the higher rocks, showing off the wings that had let her fly the little way she could not climb. Medusa's fall was sudden and brief as she dropped onto a jutting rock that pierced through the sand beneath her. Stefano could not say how old her sister had been, but she was not even the height of Uriel's bony hip. The noises she made. Stefano and Uriel had exchanged a wordless glance, each knowing the other's thought. Was this the moment when their sister emerged a true Gorgon? The moment when she finally made the same deathless howl that Stefano could create if she merely opened her wide mouth and cried out? It was not. This was not a display of strength, but of fragility. The howl was disappointingly short-lived, as the little girl had to gulp for more breath to sustain it. Breathing was an awful weakness. And then the blood appeared, pouring in a vicious stream down the child's leg. Stefano hadn't even known what it was at first, had no idea that her sister's veins ran with this sticky redness when she should be filled with ichor like a normal creature. She and Uriel ran to their sister, lifted her in their arms, cradled their wings around her. Uriel licked the blood gently from Medusa's skin. The howl subsided and the tears that ran down her cheeks disappeared. Faint salt traces all that was left of them until Uriel licked those away too. Medusa stared at the rock that had hurt her. Uriel didn't need words to understand. She drove a clawed foot into it, watching her sister as the rock fractured and smashed beneath her. And every day after that, as the angry purple welt on Medusa's skin faded, she would look at the place where the rock had been as she rubbed the itching scar, and then she would smile because it could not hurt her again. Uriel had seen to that. When Stefano summoned her sisters to her, Uriel swooping down from the skies, Medusa running from her cave, she would greet them the same way. We are one, but we are many. Medusa would always reply as though she had asked a question, which she had not. 3 isn't many. And Stefano would smile and reach down to stroke her sister's beautiful hair, curling in thick dark ringlets around her face. You are many all on your own. I don't know what you mean, the little girl said. I'm just me. And then one day she said, Are we always 3? What? Stefano didn't understand. Will we ever be more than 3? Medusa asked. She had been watching the sheep, which this summer had 5 lambs between them. Last year there had been only 2. No, darling, we'll always be 3, Stethano replied. Medusa saw the shadow cross her sister's face, but she didn't understand it. Who gave birth to me? Stethano looked at Uriel, who looked at the sheep. Sito, said Stethano. Who's that? Stethano shrugged and said, Your mother. Our mother, too. But I've never seen her, said Medusa. How can she be my mother? I thought you were my mother. She looked between the two of them. If she's my mother, why isn't she here? They had looked forward to her talking. But now Stethano felt there should be more time between a child beginning to speak and a child asking questions of every single thing she could see or not see, from the birds in the sky to the wind in her hair. Why? Stethano had tried to tell Medusa she didn't know why cormorants flew closer to the shore than other birds, or why their sure-footed sheep liked eating grass when it tasted bad to Medusa, or why the sea was colder than the sand when the sun shone equally on both. Stethano had never even noticed these things, but a lack of answers didn't deter Medusa from asking more and more questions. Stethano looked at her sister expectantly. They're in the sea, said Uriel. Who is they? Our parents. You have 2 parents, a mother and a father. Medusa frowned. Are they fish? She asked. Uriel considered the question. No, she said, not fish. The little girl began to cry. The 2 sisters looked at one another in alarm. They had grown accustomed to her precarious moods, but it still seemed odd to weep over not having fish for parents. The more perplexed they became, the harder Medusa sobbed. You wouldn't want fish for parents, said Stethano, putting her arm around her child. How would you tell one fish from another? You wouldn't know if it was your father or not. But fish are the only things that live in the sea, Medusa wailed. No, they aren't, Uriel said. Why would you say that? Because fish are all you have seen in the sea, because they come closest to the shore where you live. But the sea extends far beyond what you can see from here. It is wide and deep and full of creatures and places you have never imagined. Phorcys and Ceto live in the deepest realms of the ocean. But I couldn't live there? No, said Stethano quickly. You would drown if you tried. Promise you will never go past the rocks you know. She pointed at the huge rocks that formed the sides of their bay. Medusa nodded. I promise. Could you live in the sea? Every answer created more questions. Uriel flexed her wings. I don't think so, she said. Wet wings would be too heavy to fly, I think. Stethano nodded in agreement because she had no idea. And that's why we all live here together, Medusa asked, because we can't live in the sea and they can't live on the land? That's right, Uriel said. Even though they aren't fish, they aren't fish. What do they look like? Medusa asked. Are they like you? Uriel thought for a moment. No, not like us, she said. They are not Gorgons. Phorcys is the sea god. He doesn't have wings. He has scales, and huge claws instead of legs. Ceto is... Uriel raised her bushy eyebrows at Stethano, who had no answer for her. I don't know exactly how to describe Ceto, Uriel said. We have never seen her. Never? She lives in the depths of the ocean, Medusa. None of her children have ever seen her. Medusa sat quietly, her questions finally stilled, and her sisters hoped once again that they had kept her from feeling what they knew to be true, that she was a freak whose birth had horrified both parents. Stethano was immortal. Uriel was immortal. Their parents, grandparents, siblings were immortal. Everyone was immortal except Medusa, and creatures that no Gorgon would ever pay any heed. But now, here they were. Uriel tending her flocks like a shepherd boy, the 2 of them anxiously discussing the milk yield, Stethano hanging the dried skins of cattle across the front of their cave so that Medusa could keep warm at night, driving them into the rock with her hard talon. Everything about their days had become different once they took on the task of raising Medusa. And how could anyone have prepared Stethano for the change it had caused? She did not know where to cite the pain she felt. She resented feeling it at all. But somewhere in her body was a strange new ache, which she eventually concluded was fear. Fear! In a Gorgon! The idea was absurd, infuriating. But that was what it was. She could not keep pretending to herself it was anything else. She lived with this throbbing, this constant nagging twinge that Medusa might not be safe. So not only was she, a Gorgon, experiencing fear, but she was feeling it on behalf of another Gorgon who should be as impervious as she herself once had been. Uriel felt it too, though she was too ashamed to mention it. Stethano could see the same fluttering anxiety in her sister that she saw in herself. No wonder Phorcys had deposited the baby with them. No sea god would want to feel so weakened. A shudder ran through Stethano as she thought of what she had lost. The sweet sense of owning herself and her feelings, of having no concerns at all, or only the very mildest kind. All of this was gone, exchanged without warning for a cold, gripping panic whenever a child stumbled or hid or cried. This, she knew, was love, and she felt it even though she did not want it. Alright guys, I'm going to end it here. Hopefully you enjoyed the reading, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much for sitting with me.